let's talk about the Super Bowl, because the one thing that I would love to be a fly on the wall watching Amy do Radio Row, just because like I couldn't imagine anybody being more in their element than you. And just walk me through, because how do you manage to stay present when there is guest after guest, interview after interview? And that's my biggest question. I'm not ever worried about like you just being prepared and getting ready for your guests, but how do you stay present when there's so many people that you have to interview?
Well, and not to mention you're exhausted, or
Yeah.
I think anyone who does mornings or does nights, but also has to work during the afternoon on Radio Row.
Yeah.
That's a huge challenge because your brain is not had the sleep that it needs this week. So I was home. I didn't go to New Orleans, but I was in Vegas. And I think Vegas was my 7th or 8th Radio Row in person. And the challenge is, again, you work in the afternoons, you have to make coherent conversation as part of the interview process, because a lot of it's taped, of course. But then you also have to be engaging overnight as well. So yeah, I think that for me, and this is something that I learned personally during the pandemic, but it's also something that I now apply to work. As crazy as things have been over the last few years, all the extra responsibilities with only one person working on the show, I will tend to get overwhelmed if I think too far ahead. And again, personally during the pandemic, it was the same thing. We didn't know when things were going to change, when we're going to be back to normal, so to speak, or our typical routines. And if I look too far ahead, I would get overwhelmed by oh my gosh, how long is this going to be? And so I started to go one show, one day, 1 week at a time. That was it. That was all I asked of myself. Get through the next show and the next week, and then worry about the week after that. And it's the same thing during Radio Row when you're stacking interviews, especially when they're boom, boom, boom right on top of each other. And you have to meet people. You get to meet people, you get to smile. You have people walking up to you who want to introduce themselves, or people who would like to see. You catch them walking across the room and you want to run and catch them. It's about focusing on what you got right in front of you. What do athletes say? Be where your feet are. It's something lines, but it's kind of like that. Don't worry about the next problem until you get there. Deal with this interview right here. Because if I'm busy, we talked about listening, right? If I'm busy worrying about my questions for the next interview, then I'm going to miss what this guest is saying right here. And so I'm not great at compartmentalizing normally in my personal life, but in my professional life, I've done a lot better at that. Focus on the here and now. The interview you got to do at this moment, because if this one sucks, then, you're going to be upset and worried about that. So one interview, one day, one show, 1 week at a time. And honestly, I think it tends to slow it down. I mean, you work in baseball, so guys will talk about how when everything slows down, or a quarterback, when everything slows down, you can see it, what pitch is coming. It's almost like slow-mo, right? Well, so that's the same approach that I try to use for radio, especially during hectic weeks like Super Week. One thing at a time, one problem at a time, because tomorrow will have problems for its own.
And I love a cliche, because cliches are there for a reason. And I used to make fun of cliches until like I became one, and I was like, dude, I get it. Like
you're not a cliche. What are you talking about?
I meant like just like what you said, like when they say like you try not to do too much, and I'm like, come on, dude. And then like when I started applying that to my job, I'm like, I get it. You're right. I love a cliche because it makes sense. Like one pitcher was like, I can't think too much about it. I'm like, all right. And then later on, he was like, do you know what I'm saying? I'm like, you're right. If I do too much, I screw up my broadcast. Like I just like, you're right.
Well, and not magnifying the magnitude of a moment. So how often do you hear athletes who it's another game? They're talking about the Super Bowl or the World Series. It's another game. But if that's how they can manage it, I mean, some athletes manage it by reading a book about inner excellence on the sidelines. But if how you have to manage it is to go one play, one snap, one moment at a time, if that's how you're good at what you do, if that's how you cultivate excellence, then awesome. But it really is about not taking on too much all at once, because again, those problems are going to be there. How often and this is personal, worry and anxiety about things that never freaking happen? How often do we spend time, hours, just our brains, we can't rest. I'm speaking personally, right? Because we're worried about something down the road that may never happen. And if it does, you got plenty of time to deal with it. But I mean, the whole thing about cross that bridge when you come to it, cliche, it's so true.
And you and I really are about our faith, and there's nothing that God hasn't put us in front of that we haven't been able to handle, right? So there's times like it's been small things, it's been big things, but it's not, when we finish it, I'm like, oh, we handled it. It may have been bumpy at first, but we did it, right? And it's those types of things. You're like, okay, I got it.